All right, so now we're talking about how did the second industrial revolution affect Europe? So your question might be, well, what the heck was the second industrial revolution? And this was kind of focused on the mid to late 1800s. It goes along with the expansion of railway systems, which encouraged economic growth, and new industries are going to emerge, in particular steel, chemicals, electricity, and oil. A lot of this is going to happen because in the 1850s, Henry Bessemer is going to develop a new process to manufacture steel cheaply and in large quantities. In the 1860s, Great Britain, Belgium, France, and Britain are going to be producing in the 1860s about 125 tons of steel. By 1913, they're producing 32 million tons of steel. The other thing also is going to be the development of the chemical industry. So productions of things like sulfuric acid, laundry soap, synthetic dyes, and plastics are going to be developed. And what we're going to see is a link between science and industry. And Germany really is going to be the leader of the second industrial revolution. The biggest change during this time was the change in the application of electrical energy to production. This made factory locations more flexible, factory constructions more efficient. It also led to the first major power plant being built in Great Britain in 1881. Homes began to use electric lights, streetcars began to be electrified, subway systems were electrified. And then in 1887, you're going to have the invention of the automobile, invented by Gottlieb Daimler, and he had a French patent, even though he was German. France is going to take the lead in automobile manufacturing. The first few years, cars were basically a novelty item. But the automobile is going to, and these new industries are going to create even larger needs for chemicals and production of things like petroleum. So, how is the economy affected by changes in industry? In 1873, several banks failed and investment is actually going to slow down. There was a series of bad weather. And foreign competition, which is going to start to put pressure on European agriculture. As a result of this, food price is going to lower, which sounds good, but it actually creates a drag on the economy, and a lot of immigrants are going to be coming out of the countryside into the cities, which is going to put even greater strain on jobs in the city. So in 1873, several large banks failed and investment actually slowed down. Most people were still living in horrible conditions with pockets of unemployment. Strikes and labor unrest were common, and this began to lead to the growth of trade unions and socialist parties. But overall, as this time went on and the 19th century progressed, the standard of living is going to improve because these new industries are going to be producing consumer goods, which is going to create, make it easier for people to have more, luxuries, and this demand for them is going to help the economy. Also, because of the lower food prices, which hurt the peasants in the countryside, it actually meant that the working class had more money to spend on consumer goods. And urbanization also created larger markets. So we start to see the developments of things like department stores and chain stores and mail order catalogs. The next question is, how did population trends change? And you can see here kind of the uptick in population that we see as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The percentage of Europeans of the world population in 1900 was 20%, which is the largest it's ever been since. In 1910, the population of Europe was 447 million. After that point, birth and death rates stabilized, either declined or stabilized. And we start to see stable populations in the developing world and rapidly growing populations in the undeveloped world. You probably know more about this than I do if you took a PhD with Ms. Canone. The emancipation of the peasants meant that population became more mobile, especially with railroads and steamships and better roads, and Europeans began to migrate away from Europe in record numbers. So between 1846 and 1932, 50 million Europeans are going to leave Europe. They're going to go to the US, they're going to go to Canada, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, South America. In the mid-19th century, most of the immigrants were from Great Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. But after 1885, they're going to be mostly from South and Eastern Europe. And what this did is it actually relieved the social and population pressures that were beginning to develop in Europe, and contributed to the Europeanization of the world and had a large impact on other cultures in the world. So the next question is, how did the growth of industry affect urban development? And so you could see an image of one of these industrialized cities. Now, between 1850 and 1911, urban dwellers rose from 25 to 44% of the population in France and from 30 to 60% of the population in Germany. Many of these people faced poor housing, social anonymity, and unemployment. Ethnic groups tended to live together and had problems mixing with other groups. In the cities, there were distinct separate districts for businesses, for government offices, for retail stores, for theaters, and there weren't actually many residences. What we start to see, especially as Paris begins to be redesigned, we start to see that residential areas began moving out into the countryside, especially with trams and the metro being built in 1895, and new railway stations linking the city to the suburbs. And we start to see the redevelopment of cities and a rise in urban land values. And the result was the development of the suburbs. Now, European suburbs are very different from American suburbs. So when we think of suburbs, we think of like Floral Park, single-family homes with backyards and parks and, all types of things. Suburbs in Europe were apartment buildings or private houses, but they would be built very, very close together. Small, lawns, very small backyards. So they weren't like what we think of here in the United States. This actually is a view of Paris from the top of the Eiffel Tower, and you can kind of see some of the organization that went into the building of Paris. Here you can see one of these. This is actually in Istanbul, but you could see one of the old-time cable cars. And then, of course, the beginning of the Paris Metro in 1895. The government's goal as the 19th century progressed was to maintain public order. And I felt that in order to maintain public order, they needed to improve the health and the housing of the poor. In the 1830s and the 1840s, there was a widespread cholera epidemic, and this affected all the classes. And this was before the knowledge of the germ theory, and it was believed that disease was spread by foul odors and by filth. Eventually became realized that it was sewage in the water was what was affecting cholera, which was creating the cholera epidemic. But various reports were published that described the horrible living conditions of the poor. And the solution to the health hazards, even though they didn't quite have the germ theory yet, was the idea that things were cleaner, people would get sick less. So they began to build water and sewer systems, and mortality rates dropped significantly. If you get the sewage out of your drinking water, less people are going to get sick. So we start to see, as the 19th century goes on, the expansion of government involvement. Medical officers and building inspectors could enter homes. Private property could be condemned because of health hazards, and private land could be excavated for the building of sewers and water mains. What we also see as a result of industrialization is we start to see a backlash against this, and that's going to be a movement that's going to start in the early 19th century. There's something called the Luddites. And the Luddites would attack industry and attack the frames, the power looms. They would, destroy the machines because they were kind of like resisting against this whole process towards mechanization. And here you can see this is in northern England, the Midlands area of England, where we see kind of most of this Luddite activity. And see, they basically break the frames, destroy things. Here in 1819 was something called the Peterloo Massacre, where British soldiers fired on British workers, and they were protesting kind of the horrible working conditions. The Chartist movement also began in England, and what the Chartist movement was beginning to demand was reform and voting. So the People's Charter was drafted in 1838 by William Lovett. It was a radical campaign for parliamentary reform of the inequalities created by the Reform Bill of 1832. They wanted all men to be able to vote. They wanted equal election districts, the abolition of the requirement that members of Parliament be property owners, payment for members of Parliament, because being an MP or a member of Parliament was an unpaid position, which meant that only the very wealthy could afford to be and serve in Parliament. They wanted annual general elections and the secret ballots. So we start to see, as there's beginning to be a growing class consciousness, people beginning to demand more rights and more of a say in the government. And here you can see even women began to fight for rights to vote. Then we also have, and I mentioned this briefly before, the Corn Law. And there was an anti-corn law league that developed. And this was to give more manufacturers more outlets for their products. They wanted to expand employment. They wanted to lower the price of bread. They wanted to make British agriculture more efficient and productive, and expose trade and agriculture to foreign competition, and promote international peace through trade. Because many people felt that the corn laws, which artificially raised the price of foreign imported grain, meant that the farmers over time didn't have to be innovative in their agricultural techniques. They can kind of just rely on the fact that their prices were higher, and they didn't really have to be very innovative. They didn't really have to worry about production, and it really just kind of benefited the aristocracy and the landed gentry. We also have the development of the idea of utilitarianism, which is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who believed that the goal of society is the greatest good for the greatest number. There is a role for government intervention to provide some sort of social safety net for the people so that the cards are not so stacked against the poor. Now, the government response to all of this was an abolition of the slavery in the colonies, the Sadler Committee to look into working conditions, the Factory Act of 1833, the New Poor Law of 1834, and the Reform Bill of 1832, which broadens the vote in the cities. And so what we start to see is a series of reform bills being passed where they kind of like redistricted Parliament, but they also start to slowly expand the electorate. So before 1832, only 2% of the population was allowed to vote in England. After the Reform Bill, 3%. Then there's the 1867 Reform Bill, then there's the 1884 Reform Bill, and it's slowly but surely beginning to expand the electorate, very slowly. But so think about, how did the lives of the people change with the Second Industrial Revolution?